Hi, Rhema. It's week 27, day 2 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we are in 2 Kings chapter 2. We are coming to the end of the life of Elijah, the end of his earthly ministry, and we're picking up with his successor, Elisha. Now, we've already seen that this has been made clear by God, that Elijah was not the only faithful prophet, and that Elisha would take up that mantle. But now we see that take place, and that much is clear in the chapter. There are some parts that are a little hard to understand. We see that Elijah and Elisha are traveling together, and Elijah just, for whatever reason, keeps seeming to tell Elisha to stay behind. And we're not really clear on why. It could be perhaps that he's testing him to see how faithful will Elisha be. Will he persevere and continue? But even as we've seen since Elijah's encounter with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, he's been discouraged, and he hasn't always seemed to be 100% clear on God's plan. He's been faithful and seems to be obeying what the Lord has, but he's discouraged. Doesn't always seem to fully grasp what the Lord is doing. And so perhaps he still has questions. Perhaps he's still discouraged and asking Elisha to stay behind. But regardless, that's what he does. That's what the text tells us. But the others, the sons of the prophets, the school of the prophets, those who are learning and training, it's the idea that what you would expect in the name, the sons of the prophets, not biological sons, but those who are coming up behind Elijah and Elisha, they know what's going to happen. So God has revealed this in some way, and yet it seems inappropriate to keep talking about it. Elisha tells them, yes, I know about it, and I'll be quiet. But Elijah tells them, look, stay here because the Lord has sent me to Jericho. First they went to Bethel, now he's sending me to Jericho. And so they're coming to Jericho, and the sons of the prophets are still following along behind them. They ask the same question. This keeps going on, and it's a little hard to understand, at least in the brief amount of study for this video. But Elijah tells him, again, to stay. And Elijah takes his cloak and he rolls it up and he taps the water and parts the waters, reminiscent of Moses parting the Red Sea. We know that story. We're familiar with that. And Elijah and Elisha cross over, and Elijah asks him, look, I want you to do something for me. Please let me have a double portion of your spirit on me. Now, God's already made clear that Elisha will follow. He will take up the prophetic mantle of Elijah's ministry. But Elisha seems to be recognizing that in his own strength, he doesn't have what it takes. So he's asking for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And Elijah replies, you've asked a hard thing. Yet if you do see me as I'm taken up from you, it will be for you. But if you don't see me, it will not be so. And so Elisha keeps clinging to Elijah. But verse 11 says, as they still went on and talked, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. God's presence is wrapped up in this chariot of fire, the horses of fire, this image that we have here representing God's presence and God's power. And God takes Elijah up into heaven. And Elisha is crying out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. He knows what's coming, but he's still pleading for Elijah's presence. And I'm sure this was an overwhelming sight and experience. And he takes his own clothes and tears them in two pieces. The text tells us, verse 13, that he takes the cloak of Elijah and he goes back to the Jordan. And he taps the water, and the waters part for Elisha. So you remember when Moses did this, and then his successor Joshua did the same thing. And now Elijah has parted the waters, but his successor Elisha is doing the same thing. We have lots of parallels between Moses and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha. And now Elijah has been taken up into heaven. We understand from our study of the ascension that this is pointing to that. This is prefiguring the fact that Christ would be ascended into heaven. Not only would be resurrected, but would ascend into heaven. And the ascension, if you will, of Elijah is pointing forward towards that. Now the sons of the prophets, they recognize that the spirit of Elijah, his mantle, his prophetic ministry now rests on Elisha. But they fully don't understand. They're looking for Elijah's body, and Elisha tells them, no, don't do that. And they come to the city of Jericho. Now you remember that when Joshua, the new Moses, when they conquered Jericho, they cursed the city and said it would be uninhabitable. And now Elisha, the new Joshua, he is reversing this. He does this deal with the bowl and with the water, but we understand that this is symbolic. It's God's power that is healing the curse there in Jericho. And then the last three verses are very interesting. The text I'm reading from the ESV, and whatever you're reading probably says something about small boys. And this might give you the idea of young children. But that's not what's going on. These are young men, as in older teenagers, young men in their 20s, old enough to know better, but they're running around in a herd of them, a pack of boys, a gang, and they are at Bethel, a place where false worship has been rampant. And so you would expect these young men at Bethel are not fearing the Lord, and they are coming and they're taunting the prophet of God. And they're telling him, you bald head, why don't you go up? Why don't you be like Elijah? If you're going to carry on, be like him. Why don't you ascend into heaven as well? And they're making fun of his bald head. Again, he may have had natural baldness. He may have shaved his head as he separated into the prophetic ministry. They may just be blowing smoke. We don't know why they're saying this, but we understand that as they are taunting the prophet of God, they are taunting God himself. They are not believers in the one true and living God. And so Elisha just entrusts the situation to the Lord. He curses them in the name of the Lord. This doesn't mean he used foul language, but he delivers them over to God and says, God, you do with them what you want. Well, what does God do in his justice and his judgment? He sends 2 mama bears out of the woods, and they tear 42 of those boys apart. Now, again, this may sound very harsh, but this is God's judgment, his good and right judgment on people who are scoffing at the one true and living God. So we see here that Elijah has ascended into heaven. He's been taken up into heaven to be with God. And Elisha has taken over his prophetic ministry. And we see him validated by these miracles, by the parting of the waters, by the healing at Jericho, and by God's intervention in this situation to protect the prophet. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.